What if I told you that one of the most reliable technical compression signals in market history is currently flashing on XRP, Bollinger Bands tighter than they have been in years, and that the entire retail conversation around this signal is missing the structural point by trying to time the exact moment of the breakout instead of understanding why the breakout is mechanically inevitable? Strong claim, I know. But before you scroll past this video, ask yourself this brutal question. When has any major price breakout in financial history actually announced itself to retail in advance? When has the market ever sent a polite notification before going parabolic? You see the slight moves that come out of nowhere on weekends. No catalyst, no headline, no warning. That is not random. That is exactly how genuine breakouts behave when supply is compressed against latent demand. The Bollinger Band compression is the technical fingerprint of that exact condition. And while retail is asking when, what day, what time, institutions are operating on a completely different question entirely. How much can we accumulate before the compression releases? While the crowd is staring at indicators looking for permission to position, something far more structural is being decided behind the curtain. Today I'm going to walk you through the compression mechanics, the ISO 2022 hard deadline that almost nobody is weighting correctly, the XRP as collateral institutional thesis, and the multi-catalyst convergence that is making this the most asymmetric setup in this asset's documented history. And the world, once again, is missing the signal. Welcome back. On this channel, we don't trade hype, we decode structure. Today, we are going under the hood of one of the most under-discussed structural convergences in modern finance: the simultaneous arrival of technical compression, the swift ISO 2022 transition deadline, the institutional collateral expansion, the South Korean and global retail demand spike, and the regulatory unlock window, all stacking into the same compressed timeline. No moonboy fantasies, no emotional charts, just the technical mechanics, the deadline-driven institutional reality, and the positioning that retail has been trained to ignore. Before we go under the surface, this is informational analysis, not financial advice. Let's jump in. Let's start with the hard truth. 99% of investors looking at Bollinger Bands try to use them as timing tools. They want a specific date. They want a specific hour. They want the indicator to behave like a calendar appointment. Bollinger Bands do not work that way. Bollinger Bands measure volatility compression. When the bands tighten to historically low levels, what they are actually telling you is that price is being mechanically squeezed between supply and demand pressure that has not yet resolved itself. The longer the compression continues, the more violent the eventual resolution. That resolution can come tomorrow. It can come in 6 weeks. It can come in 3 months. What it will not do is announce itself in advance with a polite notification. It will come exactly the way that small weekend move came, without a catalyst headline, without retail social media warning, without permission. One day, you will simply wake up and the chart will look fundamentally different than it did the day before. Here's what almost nobody on this platform is willing to say clearly. The reason the bands are this tight right now is not random. It is the visible technical signature of an underlying structural condition. Supply is being compressed at exactly the same moment that institutional positioning is accumulating, and the price action is being held in a narrow range because the two forces are momentarily in equilibrium. Equilibrium between compressed supply and accumulating demand is not a stable state. It is the mathematical prelude to a violent repricing event, and the people who understand that this is a structural pattern, not a timing puzzle, position before the resolution rather than chasing it after. Brad Garlinghouse has, in different words, framed XRP's commercial trajectory in terms that imply exactly this kind of pent-up institutional deployment dynamic. David Schwartz has spoken about the operational readiness of the institutional infrastructure that once triggered becomes deployable at scale. This is not coincidence, this is convergence. And once you see the convergence, you cannot unsee it. Let me layer in another signal that retail systematically underweights. XRP is currently the #1 traded asset on Upbit, South Korea's largest exchange, by 24-hour volume. That ranking surpasses Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Tether on that platform. And the demand pattern in South Korea is not isolated. Japan continues to show structural demand. Germany has been covering the Ripple MasterCard JP Morgan institutional integrations in mainstream financial media. The global retail and institutional appetite for XRP is structurally distinct from how Western crypto Twitter perceives it. While English-language social media is dominated by the fatigue of repeated catalyst delays, the rest of the world is methodically accumulating. That divergence is itself a signal. Markets do not stay regionally fragmented forever. The demand spreading internationally eventually translates into compressed Western markets being forced to reprice. Let's do the math, the kind retail desperately wants to ignore. XRP has a hard cap of 100 billion tokens. Roughly 40 billion remain in escrow under transparent on-chain release rules. 5 to 7 billion are estimated permanently lost. Approximately 800 million XRP are now locked in ETF custodial structures. SBI Holdings has issued instruments redeemable in XRP. Evernorth Holdings holds hundreds of millions of XRP as treasury reserves. Strategic reserves, partner allocations, market maker inventory, and long-term institutional holders absorb tens of billions more. The actual freely tradable float is far, far smaller than the headline number suggests, and the freely tradable float continues to compress regardless of which day the Bollinger Bands eventually resolve. Now layer the demand picture. The global cross-border payments market processes roughly $150 trillion every single year. The foreign exchange market alone moves $7.5 trillion every single day. The Bank for International Settlements documents approximately $27 trillion sitting idle in Nostro and Vostro accounts. The derivatives market sits at an estimated $1.2 quadrillion in notional value. If even 0.5% of Nostro liquidity migrates to on-chain settlement rails over the coming years, you are talking about $135 billion of structural, recurring, non-speculative demand against a constrained float. This isn't a prediction, it is the design specification of any bridge asset absorbing institutional flows. If you have a problem with these numbers, you don't have a problem with me. You have a problem with the math of fixed supply meeting expanding demand. Now let me address the hardest deadline-driven catalyst that almost nobody on retail YouTube is weighting correctly. Swift has formally scheduled the complete retirement of unstructured payment messaging by November 2026. That is not a soft target. That is being explicitly cast as a rare hard deadline for the entire global banking system. Read that carefully. The legacy messaging format that has powered global financial communications for decades is being formally decommissioned, and ISO 2022 is the replacement standard. This is not a marketing transition. This is a regulatory and operational hard cutover that every major financial institution on Earth is operating against. Banks that fail to transition will be operationally locked out of Swift messaging by the deadline. Here's the part that retail consistently misunderstands about ISO 2022. The transition itself is not, by itself, an immediate price catalyst for ISO-aligned cryptocurrencies. We have lived through years of ISO 2022 hype cycles where retail expected dramatic immediate price action and got nothing. But the November 2026 hard deadline is structurally different from every prior ISO conversation because it is a deadline, not a target. It forces every major financial institution to complete its transition to structured messaging by a fixed date. And the cryptocurrencies that align with ISO 2022, XRP, XLM, XDC, HBR, Algo, IOTA, QNT, ADA, alongside likely additions over time, including Flare and others, are positioned to integrate into the messaging infrastructure that emerges on the other side of that cutover. Early on, you may not see significant price rise from this. But over time, as the messaging infrastructure normalizes and ISO-aligned settlement assets become operationally embedded, the structural utility compounds. Now layer in the institutional collateral expansion thesis, because this is the structural development that retail consistently fails to integrate into the price model. Ripple Prime CEO Mike Higgins has publicly stated, on the record, that XRP will be used as collateral alongside Bitcoin in institutional finance. Not might be, will be. The institutional collateral universe is expanding from just dollars or US Treasuries into Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP, Solana, stablecoins, and tokenized money market funds. The next step, in Higgins' own framing, is tokenizing anything of value and using that tokenization for collateral margin and settlement. The institutions are not waiting for XRP to prove itself further. They are operationally classifying XRP into the institutional collateral category right now. Ask yourself this brutal question. When the prime brokerage CEO of a major institutional infrastructure provider publicly classifies XRP as institutional-grade collateral, what does that mean for the pension funds, endowments, sovereign wealth funds, and corporate treasuries, whose risk frameworks are partly informed by what their prime brokers categorize as collateral grade? It means XRP enters the collateral universe of the largest pools of capital on Earth without needing additional retail validation. The institutional categorization is the validation. Now look at the broader chessboard. Ripple has spent the last several years deploying over $3 billion in strategic acquisitions, specifically to build the institutional bridge required for whale-tier capital to commit at scale. Medico for bank-grade custody, standard custody for New York regulated trust services, Hidden Road as a prime brokerage clearing trillions annually, Rail for stablecoin-powered payments, G Treasury for Fortune 500 corporate treasury management, Palisade for advanced wallet and custody technology. And most recently, and this is something retail YouTube has not properly processed, Ripple has partnered with Neuberger on a $200 million debt facility specifically to expand Ripple Prime's prime services and margin financing capabilities. Ripple has explicitly stated that institutional demand is rising and they are positioning the balance sheet to meet that demand. That is not a startup hoping for adoption. That is a company expanding its operational capacity in direct response to documented institutional demand growth. While retail is panic selling and arguing about meme coins ahead of the Clarity Act, the institutional signal has never been louder. Larry Fink at BlackRock has gone from publicly dismissing crypto to championing tokenization as the future of every financial asset. Franklin Templeton has launched on-chain money market funds. Fidelity has expanded its digital asset custody operations. JP Morgan continues to deepen blockchain-based settlement work, recently completing a documented cross-border tokenized treasury settlement on the XRP ledger in under 5 seconds. The Bank of Japan, the Japanese FSA, the European Central Bank, and the IMF are all publishing on tokenization and on-chain settlement. The retail crowd is staring at the Bollinger Bands looking for permission. The institutions are staring at deadline calendars, collateral expansions, and infrastructure deployment timelines. One of them is going to be very, very right. The other is going to be writing comments on YouTube about how they were lied to. Now let me address the meme coin warning that responsible analysis demands. There is currently significant retail enthusiasm building around meme coins ahead of the Clarity Act. The thinking is that any regulatory clarity will lift all crypto assets, including meme coins. That thinking is structurally dangerous. Here is the uncomfortable reality. If the Clarity Act passes, it will explicitly classify certain digital assets as commodities, others as securities, and many as something else entirely. The cryptocurrencies that fail to fit cleanly into the commodity classification framework face a real risk of being effectively regulated out of existence on a timeline that retail meme coin buyers are not prepared for. Imagine buying a meme coin, watching it rise on Clarity Act enthusiasm, and then discovering that the same act forces that coin to wind down or comply with securities regulations it cannot meet. That is not a hypothetical. That is a documented risk profile of speculative coins that lack clear utility, real-world use cases, or regulatory alignment. This may genuinely be the last cycle where serious money is made on meme coins, and the risk-adjusted return profile is structurally worse than it appears on the surface. Utility-driven cryptocurrencies, assets that solve real-world settlement problems, integrate with institutional infrastructure, and align with ISO 2022 messaging, are positioned for a fundamentally different regulatory outcome. So when does the technical compression collide with the visible market? Pay attention here, because the catalysts are no longer theoretical. The Clarity Act and broader market structure legislation moving through Congress represent the immediate regulatory unlock. The Senate Banking Committee markup is on the calendar. The legislative path from markup to floor vote to House reconciliation to presidential signature projects on the realistic timeline into the early summer window. The November 2026 SWIFT ISO 2022 hard deadline creates a separate, independent timeline forcing institutional integration regardless of U.S. legislation. The expansion of XRP into institutional collateral universes is happening operationally right now, before either of those deadlines arrive. In Asia, Japan's Financial Services Agency has already moved decisively to recognize XRP as a regulated digital asset. The Bank of Japan continues to publish CBDC research that explicitly discusses interoperability layers. The European Union's MiCA regulation is now fully operational. Each of these is another wall coming down between institutional capital and on-chain settlement. Then there is the macro layer. The Federal Reserve continues to evolve its posture. Global debt levels continue to force every major central bank to consider new settlement architectures. The IMF has openly discussed the need for a more efficient cross-border framework. Layer on top of that the rise of AI agents requiring instant programmatic settlement. The fuse is already lit. There are multiple fuses. They are lit in parallel, and they are burning toward overlapping resolution windows. Now let me address the tokenization timeline that retail consistently misjudges. There is a widespread belief in the community that tokenization is years away. That belief is structurally wrong. The DTCC, the SEC's evolving stance on tokenization under chair leadership that has publicly described tokenization as unavoidable, BlackRock's documented tokenization roadmap, the Nasdaq's exploration of blockchain frameworks, and the parallel work happening at Securitize and other major tokenization platforms collectively suggest that the second half of 2026 is when trillions of dollars of real-world assets begin migrating on-chain at scale. That is not a vague future projection. That is the documented institutional roadmap. But, and this is the discipline responsible analysis demands, the rise of tokenization requires better regulatory infrastructure than currently exists. Consider the implications. If someone tokenizes their house and sells a portion of the tokens to raise cash, what happens when the next buyer of that house discovers they are only buying 80% ownership and a previous token holder retains 20%? The legal frameworks for fractional tokenized real-world asset ownership need to mature substantially before retail-facing tokenization can scale safely. We need better laws. We need significantly more public education around tokenization mechanics, and we need clearer regulatory frameworks around what happens when tokenized claims conflict with traditional property rights. The institutional tokenization will happen first: DTCC tier settlement, regulated securities, treasury products. Retail tokenization of real-world assets will follow on a longer timeline as the legal infrastructure matures. Now let's talk about the broader macro context that responsible analysis must include. Tether has been minting 1 billion USDT batches and deploying them into Bitcoin price action repeatedly over an extended period. This pattern is not sustainable indefinitely. Tether cannot pass MiCA tier regulatory requirements in Europe. It cannot fully pass emerging US stablecoin regulatory standards, which is why a separate US market-specific stablecoin product has been engineered to address those requirements. As the rest of the world adopts MiCA-like or US-like stablecoin frameworks, Tether's structural future becomes increasingly uncertain. And if Tether faces regulatory pressure that affects its ability to continue the minting and deployment pattern, Bitcoin's price discovery mechanism faces structural questions retail has not priced in. This is not a Tether bashing point. This is a structural observation about systemic risk in the broader crypto market. XRP's value proposition becomes structurally stronger in the scenario where stablecoin regulation forces market participants toward fully reserved, regulator-supervised alternatives like RLUSD operating on transparent, auditable infrastructure. Now let's talk about the side of the equation most people refuse to confront: supply drain. While the demand side is being assembled by institutional collateral expansion, ISO 2022 transition pressure, ETF accumulation, sovereign adjacent institutional partners, treasury vehicles, AI-driven payment flows, the Neuberger debt facility expansion, and the global retail demand in markets like South Korea, the supply side is being quietly removed from the open market. Exchange reserves of XRP have been trending lower for an extended period. Crypto quant data, Glassnode analytics, on-chain forensic researchers, every credible source confirms the same trend. Tokens are leaving exchanges and entering custody. Once a token enters a multi-signature institutional vault, an ETF custodian's reserves, a treasury allocation, or a long-term holding wallet, it does not come back to market for a 10% profit. It is gone. It is parked. It is reserved for the new system. We are moving from an era of abundance to an era of scarcity, and retail has not priced this in. Think about what that means in practical terms. When the Bollinger Bands resolve, when the Clarity Act passes, when the SWIFT deadline forces operational integration, when the institutional collateral expansion translates into actual deployed capital, when ETF flows accelerate post-clarity, the available float on exchanges will be a fraction of what it appears to be on paper today. Order books will be thin, buy walls will be hollow, and the price discovery process will not be gradual. It will be violent. The XRP rich list already shows wallets in the shark tier, those holding between 100,000 and 1 million XRP, growing in number through every recent down cycle. Long-term holding wallets sit at all-time highs. The supply transfer from impatient hands into patient institutional custody is happening right now, in real time, on the public ledger. New buyers eventually will not be buying whole XRP. They will be buying drops. 1 XRP equals 1 million drops, and very soon drops will be the only unit late retail can afford to accumulate. There's a phrase you will start hearing more often: the great priced out. It refers to the moment when retail realizes they can no longer afford whole tokens, only fractions, and that the entry prices they wanted to pay no longer exist. The window is closing, not in years, in quarters. And here is the asymmetric insight retail keeps missing. It does not matter whether you bought XRP at 30 cents, at $1.42, or at $3 and beyond. Anyone who positions before the institutional money fully deploys will look back, regardless of their specific entry price, and realize the price at which they accumulated was structurally irrelevant relative to the post-institutional repricing. The early positioners win. The exact entry price is a rounding error compared to the structural shift that follows. I know exactly what you're feeling right now. You're watching red candles. You're seeing the Bollinger Bands tighten without immediate resolution. You're watching meme coin enthusiasm distract attention from utility-driven assets. You're seeing influencers pivot to whatever shiny narrative is trending this week, and the temptation to give up, to demand a specific date for the breakout that no honest analyst can give you, has never been louder. I understand that, but my job is to help you distinguish between noise and signal. The give me a date demand is noise. The meme coin enthusiasm is noise. The catalyst fatigue exhaustion is noise. The signal is the technical compression, the documented swift hard deadline, the institutional collateral expansion, the Neuberger debt facility scaling, the supply drain, the global retail demand spreading across multiple jurisdictions, and the regulatory pathway that is actually scheduled. None of that stopped because retail wants an exact date. It accelerated. Being early feels exactly like being wrong, right up until the moment reality catches up. That is the cruelest psychological trap in this entire industry, and the institutions know it. They are counting on it. They need a steady stream of exit liquidity from the impatient to fund the entry of the patient. Markets reward anticipation, not confirmation. By the time the breakout makes the news, the early positioners will have already set their floor positions. The late buyers will be paying premiums on a constrained float against fully unlocked institutional demand. 6 years ago, when XRP was at 30 cents, the analysts saying, "This asset is going to fundamentally reshape global finance," were dismissed as fantasists. Today, looking back, the people who positioned at 30 cents and held are sitting on multi-X returns. At $1.42, the same dismissal happens. In several years, looking back from a fundamentally different price environment, the people who positioned at $1.42 and held will look at today's price the way today's holders look at 30 cents. The entry price is a rounding error. The structural shift is everything. People who focused on XRP at 30 cents failed. People who focus on XRP at $1.42 will fail. The asset's structural trajectory does not care about your specific entry point. It cares about whether you positioned before the institutions completed their accumulation phase. The combination of the technical compression, the swift ISO 2022 hard deadline, the institutional collateral expansion, the Neuberger debt facility, the global retail demand pattern across Asia and Europe, the Clarity Act window in Washington, the parallel regulatory clarity across MyCA and the Japanese FSA, the tokenization roadmap accelerating into the second half of 2026, the macro liquidity environment approaching, the demographic gravity of generational wealth transfer, and the constrained supply structure. All of this is converging in the same compressed window. This is not a single catalyst. This is a structural convergence operating across multiple independent fronts simultaneously, with hard deadlines forcing institutional integration on schedules that retail emotion cannot delay. The XRP thesis has never had this many simultaneously aligned variables, not at any prior point in this asset's history. If you've made it this far in the video, you are not the confused, you are the informed. Hold that line. Let me leave you with this. The exact breakout date is a distraction. The compression is the reality. One is a question retail keeps demanding an answer to. The other is the technical and structural fingerprint of an unresolved force that must mechanically resolve in one direction. The question is, are you watching the indicator looking for permission, or are you watching the convergence and positioning before the resolution? History does not reward comfort. It rewards those who pay attention when the room is quiet. And right now, the room is very, very quiet, exactly the way the Bollinger Bands need it to be while the compression continues building. If you made it to the end of this analysis, drop the word compression in the comments. I want to see who actually understood what was decoded today. If you value this kind of deep structural breakdown, subscribe and turn on notifications because the catalysts are accelerating across every front simultaneously. The math doesn't lie, and the system is almost complete. Stay patient, stay positive. And as we always do, we don't wait for the future, we plan for it. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decision.